Let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'd also like to welcome our President and CEO, Jane Harman. Who's that? Jane, wave to everybody if you would. Just delighted to have her with us this morning. I also want to, of course, welcome the people watching on the web, and we have quite a number of cameras here, so welcome to all of you. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the Wilson Center on America and the global economy. And I want to stress that this today is a pan-Wilson Center effort. We are working with a whole series of programs here, the Asia program, the Latin American program, which is very interested in Latin American and Asian ties, the Canada Institute, the Kissinger Institute, and the Mexico Institute, and then a special thanks to our senior scholar, Bill Christ, who's been such an effective advisor. Actually, I see another notable in the back of the room there, Mike Van Dusen, who's our executive vice president and really makes things run on time here. Let me just give you a quick word about the Wilson Center for those of you who are new to it. President Wilson, as you may know, was the only president who've earned a PhD. So when Congress wanted to honor him, in the end they decided against a marble statue or another monument on the mall and created this living memorial. And the mission they gave the center was to bring together both sides of Wilson's life, that academic life that studied public policy, and then the action life that really made public policy, first as governor of New Jersey, and then, of course, as a two-term president. We have here, over the course of a year, maybe 150 people that come to do research with a focus on public policy. We have a range of programs that cover the whole world. You heard some of them that are sponsoring this event. And then we have some cross-cutting programs that focus on key issues: national security, innovation systems, the American and global economies, and global sustainability and resilience. So we work to bring together the people doing the best thinking on public policy, together with people like yourselves, many of whom are doing that good thinking, and many of you who are influencing and making public policy. Well, that brings me to my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Demetrios Marantis. He is the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. He plays a key role in trade negotiations with a focus on Asia, Africa, as well as global initiatives on economic development and the environment. He is a lead person in terms of working from our point of view, from America's point of view, in negotiating the TPP. He came to his current position with a wealth of experience. He was the Chief International Trade Counsel in the Senate Finance Committee, served as Associate General Counsel at USTR, private practice in Washington and Brussels for Akin Gump. Not surprisingly, he brought with him a distinguished academic background with a degree from Princeton. As you know, Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton at one point, and a JD from Harvard Law School. The ambassador will make some remarks, and then he's graciously agreed to take a few questions. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kent. Thank you to the Wilson Center for putting this on. And it's an honor to be here with Congresswoman Jane Harman as well, who has done so much to further public policy here in Washington and in the U.S. You know, many of you who know me know that I can go on and on and on and on and on and then some, talking about TPP and why it's, you know, the greatest thing in the entire world. I will try to contain my enthusiasm in these remarks. Maybe I'll save that for Q&A. You've all heard President Obama, you've all heard Ambassador Kirk talk about why TPP is such a central component of this administration's trade policy, and why focusing on the Asia-Pacific region, which, as you all know, is a key destination for U.S. exports. 60% of U.S. goods exports go to the Asia-Pacific. 3/4 of U.S. agricultural exports go to the Asia-Pacific. Asia-Pacific is home to 40% of the world's trade. So focusing on Asia-Pacific, as the President and Ambassador Kirk have said repeatedly, is critical to America's economic competitiveness, as well as to creating and supporting the good-paying jobs that result from international trade. But I've been feeling, you know, sort of reflective lately, and, you know, flashing back to 2009, when President Obama announced that the U.S. would participate in the TPP, he, Ambassador Kirk, and others had announced that there were a number of key goals that we wanted to achieve through the TPP. One was to conclude a 21st century agreement that addresses new problems, integrates the region, and enhances U.S. competitiveness in the Asia-Pacific. Another was to build a regionally diverse agreement that includes developed economies and developing economies. Another goal that was articulated was to integrate into one agreement countries that already have FTAs between and amongst themselves, with oftentimes different rules and different standards on similar issues. Another goal that was articulated was to negotiate a living agreement that remains open to new members and helps to further the vision of achieving a free trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific. Another goal was to include in the TPP new issues, things that have never been done before in a trade agreement, or new approaches to old issues that also were new and innovative ways of approaching trade issues, borrowing from work that was done in other fora like APEC. The last goal was to get all of these done and accomplish all these goals as quickly as possible. And let me say, it's been quite a tall order since 2009, but we have made a remarkable amount of progress since the U.S. joined TPP in November 2009. And the credit, goes to the fact that we're negotiating this agreement with like-minded trading partners who all share the goals that I just articulated and all share the same vision of the TPP as really being, the platform for regional integration through a high standard, high quality trade agreement. So over the past, 2+ years, TPP partners have really coalesced around a number of key themes. And I wanted to go through these themes and explain how we're trying to accomplish them in the context of the TPP. The first theme is we all want to negotiate a high standard, comprehensive agreement. And all TPP countries recognize that if the TPP is going to be, the premier regional trade agreement and the model for how to conduct and negotiate trade agreements in the future, it has to be ambitious. So what does that mean? Obviously that means that the agreement has to be comprehensive and not cover just goods, but also cover services. And not just cover traditional services, but also the services of the future. And I think this is something that we take for granted. In the TPP, as in some past trade agreements, we're negotiating on services on a negative list basis, meaning that everything's covered unless a country takes a specific exception. And if you think back to when the NAFTA was done in the early 90s, there are services that exist today that no one was even thinking about back then. Or even 5 years ago, who knew what social networking services were? For example, who knew what cloud computing was or cloud-based services were? If we don't have an agreement that automatically incorporates things that we're not even thinking about today, the agreement is essentially becomes out of date as soon as it's negotiated. And that's why in the context of the TPP, we're negotiating, for example, services commitments on quote-unquote a negative list basis to ensure that the internet-based services, the services of some other, platform that we're not even thinking about today are covered today and going forward. The second sort of theme is that TPP is a regional agreement. That sounds obvious, but why does that matter? Obviously, all the TPP countries care a lot about global trade liberalization and are committed to continuing efforts at global trade liberalization in the WTO. What the TPP allows us to do is to incubate new ideas that have never been covered before in a trade agreement, figure out how to address those in the context of the TPP, and then possibly carry those new negotiations or those new obligations on into another fora. What's great about doing a regional agreement is that you can do this kind of experimentation, but you do it in a way that makes it as valuable as possible for exporters in the region. So we're negotiating on a regional basis. What does that mean? So what we're trying to do, for example, in the area of rules of origin, is have a common TPP set of rules of origin that include cumulation. Why is that important? Because that allows businesses and exporters to be able to create regional supply chains and take advantage of the efficiencies that regional supply chains establish. And why is that important to the United States? Because it will allow U.S. businesses to stay here and participate in regional supply chains rather than feeling like they have to move offshore in order to take advantage of the Asia-Pacific supply chains. If we're a part of it through regional rules of origin, through a trade agreement that includes cumulation, that will allow our businesses to participate in regional supply chains from here in the U.S. The third theme, and again, it's something that sounds very obvious, but once you sort of start peeling the onion, becomes more and more interesting, is one of the key things that TPP countries are trying to do is to tackle non-tariff barriers. We've been told repeatedly by exporters that the key challenges they face around the world are behind the border barriers that countries put in place. So what we're trying to do in a whole variety of ways through the TPP is to try to make the regulatory processes work more seamlessly so that regulations don't inadvertently become non-tariff barriers. So how are we doing this? For example, in the chapter that we're negotiating on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, we are doing stuff that's unprecedented. We're negotiating state-of-the-art WTO plus commitments to make sure that SPS measures are grounded in science, are subject to a transparent regulatory process, so that trade flows in a more predictable fashion. Likewise, in the area of technical barriers to trade, we are focusing on developing new common approaches to, in specific sectors, so that we have, again, a common approach on how we're going to address particular technical barriers to trade as they emerge. Another really interesting area, which I guess sounds very wonky but is actually very significant, is another thing we're trying to do is to promote regulatory coherence. What does that mean? That means that we're trying to ensure that TPP partners follow good regulatory practices like we do in the US. Why is that important? If a good regulatory process will help ensure a couple things. One, that a regulator doesn't put in place an arbitrary regulation that's designed to benefit the particular sector that it's regulating. Second, one of the big problems that we face is sometimes regulators in other countries, the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. And so you'll have a regulation being put in place by one agency that ends up undermining something that another agency is doing, and hence creating a trade barrier in an inadvertent way. And so what we're trying to do by helping to promote good regulatory practices is to ensure that advertent and inadvertent trade barriers aren't put into place, again, to allow trade to flow more seamlessly throughout the Asia-Pacific region. A fourth sort of theme that we're trying to focus on are how do you deal with cross-cutting issues that are common throughout the agreement that will be of benefit in a new way. And one area I'd like to point to that we're still working very hard on is how do you better integrate small and medium-sized enterprises into global trade? We have done a ton of outreach, and the one thing we hear time and time again from SMEs, from small and medium-sized enterprises, is these trade agreements are great. However, it's really hard for us to take advantage of them because we face difficult regulatory hurdles in certain countries. We face a lack of transparency. It's hard for us to be able to even access the tariff schedules of another country to know what the actual tariff rates are. And so what we're trying to do through the TPP is to make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to access the information that they will need in order to take advantage of the commitments that we're negotiating as part of the agreement. Remember how important SMEs are. They are really the backbone of our economy, and they are the primary source of jobs here in the United States. SMEs are the largest group of U.S. exporters, and they are also major users of imported parts that end up going into products that they then export. So better integrating SMEs into regional trade flows through the TPP will bring actual significant value to what really are the #1 exporters, at least in our country. A fifth theme, and this is one that I've talked about before, and which a theme that actually really excites me quite a bit, is we're trying to tackle issues in TPP that we've never done before in a trade agreement. We're trying to deal with newly emerging issues that we've heard are problems from exporters and all the consultations that we're doing. So for example, for the first time ever in the TPP, we're negotiating disciplines that will help to level the playing field between state-owned enterprises and from their private sector counterparts. This is obviously very important, and this is an important theme we hear time and again from exporters, is that in some markets they face competition from SOEs who may benefit from privileges and immunities that private sector companies don't benefit from. So this is a new opportunity the TPP provides us to try to address this issue. Similarly, in the area of digital trade, it's a new frontier in terms of what we're trying to do in the TPP. For example, we are trying to guarantee the free flow of information. So if you're an exporter of a service and you need to make sure that you can transfer data in order to offer that service, we are trying to negotiate an obligation that would ensure that you can do that, and that a country doesn't, for example, put into place or block a website that prevents you as a service provider from offering your business, recognizing that it's very hard, particularly if you're an internet-based service provider, to be able to offer your service without being able to offer the data. Likewise, one of the things that we've heard repeatedly from cloud-based service providers and other services is the importance of an obligation that would allow you to offer your service without having to locate, for example, a data center in a particular territory. There are obligations that are sort of creeping up in different markets where a regulation will say you can only offer the service if you locate a specific data center in this territory. That makes it much harder for the company, the exporter, to be able to offer that service. So as part of our efforts in the TPP to promote digital trade, we're trying to address that issue. We're also doing really neat new things in the area of intellectual property. For the first time ever, the U.S., just last month in our most recent round of negotiations in San Diego, put forward a proposal that enshrines the ability or would obligate countries to strike the right balance between, on the one hand, providing high, strong copyright protections, and on the other hand, ensuring that exceptions and limitations exist, for example, so that companies and providers can offer services, for example, over the internet. In other words, to enshrine that the fair use for comment, for criticism, for reporting, for research, for scholarship is enshrined in a trade agreement, something we've never done before. We're also trying to address, for the first time ever, the common problem of indigenous innovation, where countries may force investors to adopt a certain local technology in order to invest in that market. It's a new thing that we've never done before in a trade agreement. And another really interesting thing, which I actually had the pleasure of being able to talk about here at the Wilson Center in December, is we're doing really neat things in the area of trade and environment. The U.S. has put forward a really interesting conservation proposal that seeks to address illegal trade in wildlife, illegal trade in logging, and illegal trade in fisheries. Again, something that we've never done before in a trade agreement. The sixth theme that I want to highlight, and again, this is obviously critical to TPP, is making sure that TPP is a living agreement and that it is able to integrate new countries as they become ready to meet the high standards of the TPP. And this is really important. Remember that when we started these negotiations back in 2009, The TPP was a group of 7 countries with an 8th, Vietnam, in an associate member status. Since that time, Malaysia, a huge, vibrant economy, has joined the TPP, and Vietnam has become a full member, making it the TPP-9. In June, at the Los Cabos G20 summit in Mexico, the TPP-9 became the TPP-11 with the addition of Canada and Mexico pending completion of our and other TPP countries' domestic consultation procedures. And just a little sort of commercial, sidebar. We have, as part of the entry and the integration of Canada and Mexico into the TPP, we have put out a Federal Register notice, a notice for public comment for anybody that's interested in commenting on what our negotiating objectives should be with respect to Canada and Mexico when they join the TPP. Comments are due to USTR on September 4th-ish, I forgot the exact date, and we'll be having a public hearing on that very issue, I believe on September 21st, 22nd-ish. So for those of you who are interested in submitting comments, please do so. We very much actively seek those and would welcome that. So anyway, back to TPP being a living agreement. Japan has also expressed interest in joining the TPP, and as we did with Canada and Mexico, we are currently continuing our talks with Japan on Japan's interest to join the TPP. We've done a lot of work over the past 2.5 years, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. The TPP trade ministers will meet in about a month in Vladivostok on the margins of the APEC leaders meeting, which will be held there. The next round of TPP negotiations, the 14th round, will take place in Leesburg, Virginia, in early September. And though we have made an enormous amount of progress in the 13 rounds of negotiations to date, we still have a lot of work to do. The leaders of the TPP countries have instructed us to make as much progress as we can, which we are very much on track to do so. But there are also, as you get later and later in the negotiations, that's when you have to really address the more difficult and sensitive issues, and that's the stage that we are in now in these negotiations. So we've got a lot more work to do, but with the momentum that we've had and with the single-minded purpose that the 9 TPP countries have approached the negotiations so far, I'm very confident that we are on track to realizing the dream of the TPP, which is concluding a high-standard 21st century agreement that serves as a platform for regional integration in the Asia Pacific. And it's been a real thrill for me to be part of this process. And there's a lot in here. And I should probably stop there because I'm sure there's a lot on your minds in terms of questions on what we're doing and how it affects particular sectors, which I would be very happy to answer. So with that, why don't we start questions? And I appreciate your patience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Really appreciate your remarks and taking the time to be with us. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll turn to the gentleman in the far back, and there's a gentleman here, and a gentleman right up front, and then we'll ask the ambassador to comment. If you could please identify yourself.
Thank you. Dong Hui-Yu with China Review News Agency. You didn't mention China. What's the U.S. position for China's participation in TPP? Thank you.
Great. And the gentleman there, I think, had a question. And then the gentleman up here in the front.
Hi, Ambassador. Jamie Strawbridge from Inside U.S. Trade. One very broad question and one specific question. On the broad, you mentioned the ministers meeting in September. Ambassador Kirk's also going to the ASEAN summit right before that, so there's a lot of political opportunity here coming up. Can you comment on what specifically you hope this kind of political discussion can yield in terms of TPP, and if any specific issues will be addressed? And then the second specific one, on intellectual property rights, it's been one of the toughest issues in the talks, a lot of resistance, especially on access to medicines. How committed is the U.S. to sticking with its access window proposal, or is it time to start reconsidering?
And the distinguished gentleman here in the front, second row.
I don't see the distinguished gentleman, but I'll have the mic in my hand. Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Mine's also on China. Is it a success without China? Does China want the TPP? Do we want China in the TPP?
Let me add one more question, Mr. Ambassador. The ambassador has really set a record here at the Wilson Center, I should say. We've had more RSVPs than for any other single in-house event here.
It's because it's August.
Yeah. No, I think when we have an outstanding speaker on a key issue, that's the answer. We have a question from the overflow room, and it has to do with the TPP, including provisions for financial services.
Sure.
Wait, let me take them in whatever order you like.
Okay, I'll start with China since there were two questions on China. It's very important to remember that the whole vision of TPP is to serve as a platform for integration in the Asia Pacific. And we have said, we and the other TPP partners have said repeatedly that the TPP is open to whichever country is willing to meet the high standards of the TPP agreement. And you know, as I think has been shown over the past year and a half, by integrating Malaysia, fully integrating Vietnam, and now integrating Canada and Mexico, that vision is you know, becoming more and more of a reality. You know, as it has been said also, TPP is not, you're not invited. It's not a party that you know, people are invited to join. It's a serious trade agreement that if a country is interested in being part of it, they have to, you know, demonstrate not just to the U.S., but to all the TPP countries, since new members or new entrants into the TPP must be decided by a consensus of TPP members. They have to demonstrate, you know, that their readiness and ability to meet, you know, the high standards that we're negotiating. So whether it's China, whether it's Japan, whether it's, you know, whichever Asia Pacific economy, you know, it's open, but the country has to be able to demonstrate before the TPP members will form a consensus that it's willing and able to meet the high standards that we're negotiating on, you know, on trade, on IP, on services, on investment, on labor, on the environment. And it's a question for, I think each economy has to make that judgment for itself as to whether or not TPP makes sense for it, whether or not TPP makes sense for where that country is in terms of its level of economic development or you know, the way it sort of sees its economy going in the future. So that's sort of the China question.
Maybe financial services, and then we can go to inside U.S. trade.
Okay, on Jamie, we won't forget you. on financial services, yes, that is a part of the agreement. It's an important part of the services commitments that we negotiate in the TPP are on financial services. Financial services is always, you know, a difficult issue because countries have you know, specific ways that they regulate their own financial services sector. But as we have been very clear, we include in the TPP, you know, what's called the prudential carve-out to ensure that economies are able to take, you know, whatever prudential measure they need to take to regulate their financial system. And that's very important for economies, including the U.S. On Jamie's questions with respect to the ministers' meeting and to Ambassador Kirk traveling to the region, so we have the TPP ministers, as I mentioned in my remarks, will meet in Vladivostok. And it's a great opportunity for the ministers to sit down together and to be able to assess where things are, you know, address any particular issues that may come up, and help actually task the negotiators, us, with, you know, lighting a fire under us to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is, you know, getting as much done as quickly as possible and meeting the goal of achieving a high standard TPP agreement. Ambassador Kirk's travel in the region, you know, gives him an opportunity to talk bilaterally to his counterparts, and again to assess, you know, progress, you know, troubleshoot on issues as they arise. So, you know, it's an opportunity to make progress and to continue to infuse momentum into TPP. On IP, you know, as Jamie mentioned, it's a tough issue. IP, the disciplines, the obligations in the intellectual property chapter are vast and cover areas ranging from patents, trademarks, copyright, geographic indications, trade secrets. The length of the IP chapter, as you've seen in previous FTAs that the U.S. has concluded, is rather large because there's just a lot in the area of IP to cover. And there are issues like access to medicines, which has been very controversial. The U.S. put forward a proposal that we felt very strongly would drive access to medicines in the developing world in a way that helps to promote innovation. We've gotten a lot of comments and criticism about our proposal that we are reflecting upon very carefully.
Could you take another round of questions,
Sure.
Mr. Ambassador? The gentleman with the sunglasses there. Sorry about that. And then there's a gentleman against the wall there, and a gentleman over here.
There you go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Ready? Steve Winters, local researcher. If I could give just one more thing on the China angle. I believe President Ma in Taiwan has said that he's very enthusiastic about Taiwan joining, but it'll probably take a while. He's thinking of maybe an 8-year time period. Also, I recently heard Stephen Hadley speak. He had been over in China, just back from China. He said he spoke to the leaders in China. They told him bluntly, TPP is something that's directed against China. It's it's against us. And Mr. Hadley, of course, didn't agree with that viewpoint. But are we getting into some kind of sticky wicket here if Taiwan becomes a member of TPP and so forth? There's only one China really recognized by anybody. Has some thought been given to this?
There was a gentleman there against the wall, then there was a gentleman over here as well.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. I follow up on the gentleman's question.
So theme
President
here,
Ma has actually said that Taiwan wants to join the TPP within 8 years. Do you think that time frame is realistic? One other thing, Taiwan has agreed to allow U.S. beef to go into Taiwan. Given that, would the resumption of TIFA on your minds now or on the minds of those who work at USTR? Thank you very much.
And then the gentleman over here against the wall.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. You mentioned, some people say the negotiations are going very well over the last few years because of the lack of ministerial involvement. I assume there will come a time where ministerial decisions would have to be made. Will they be made in Russia a month from now? And also, is the elections in the United States going to hold things up a little bit, as they usually do?
Let me add one more
Okay.
from our overflow room. Given the concerns of members of Congress about the secrecy of the process, will USTR push TPP partners to release the text at this point in the process?
Well, why don't I work backwards this time instead of working forwards, and I'll start with that question. USTR, this has been the most transparent trade negotiation that has ever been negotiated. We have done outreach to stakeholders across the U.S. In ways that are really unprecedented. Our negotiators provide opportunities repeatedly for as much engagement from stakeholders, from members of Congress as possible. At the TPP rounds of negotiations, we've done some really neat things with respect to stakeholder involvement to increase stakeholder involvement and increase transparency in the process. For example, at each round of TPP negotiations, there's a day where stakeholders come and are able to either make presentations to negotiators or to be able to engage with negotiators on a one-on-one basis. There's a lot of misperception out there with respect to transparency, and I'm actually very proud of the work that this administration has done to infuse as much public participation into this process as possible. One of the issues that comes up is why don't you release the negotiating text? There's a reason for that. When you're negotiating an agreement, if you're going to end up negotiating an agreement in public, it limits the ability of negotiators to have the flexibility to achieve the positions that are in the best interest of their country. And so that's why we're trying to strike a balance between ensuring the integrity of the negotiations, that we're not negotiating the TPP in the press, versus making sure that our stakeholders, whoever they are, whether they're from the business community, whether they're from NGOs, whether they're from labor unions, whether they're academics, have as much access to us, to the negotiators, as possible, so that we can incorporate their feedback into what we're doing. And quite frankly, the negotiations and our positions in the TPP are better for it. All of the input that we have gotten, whether they're through public comments, whether they're through one-on-one meetings, whether they're from, through our advisory committee process, has allowed us to hone our negotiating position and accomplish what is in the best interest of U.S. exporters in the TPP. So that's that question. The question on ministerial involvement. Ambassador Kirk, I, and the ministers and vice ministers of the TPP countries have been directly involved in the TPP from the start, and will continue to do so. And as I said, Jim, the ministerial meeting in Vladivostok gives the opportunity for ministers all collectively to meet together, assess progress, and help guide the negotiators in terms of what the next steps should be. On China, this is absolutely not a negotiation that's directed at China. As I said before, the whole purpose of TPP is to be a platform for regional integration. And the vision is that this serves as the pathway for a free trade agreement in the Asia Pacific. Again, if China, if Thailand, if the Philippines, whoever, as long as countries are able to meet the high standards that we're negotiating, that's the litmus test. And that's a question for the various countries as to whether or not they're prepared to do so. And the same applies to Taiwan. I understand that President Ma has made that statement. Again, it's for Taiwan to be able to convince both the US and the other TPP partners that Taiwan is a reliable trading partner and is able to meet the high standards that the TPP is negotiating. On beef, we welcome the news out of Taiwan on US beef, and we'll have to see how that is implemented over the course of the next few months. We have a TIFA with Taiwan, which has been on hold for a while, and the news out of Taiwan on beef, I think, is very positive. And again, I think we'll have to sort of see how things play out in the next few months before making any decisions on the TIFA.
Can you take a few more? Just a couple more?
Probably one or two more than I really need
Just
to say
take this
that all.
gentleman, then I have one more from the overflow
Okay.
room, and then you've been very generous, and we appreciate that.
Mike Masedig with the PBS Online NewsHour. I mean, it's not just China. There's this discussion of a potential FTA with China, Korea, and Japan. But although Japan may be trying to put chips on two tables, where does that fit into this overall development?
And from the overflow room, and we thank the patience of the overflow room people, as for small and medium-sized businesses, how are you concretely ensuring an effort to lower their procedural and unit conversion burdens?
I'm not sure what procedural and unit conversions means, but what we're trying to do in the context of SMEs is to make sure that difficulties that they've had in terms of trading and being integrated into regional trading flows are minimized. So how do you do that concretely? You help SMEs ensure that they have access to the kinds of information that they need in order to be able to trade, like tariff schedules, like regulations, and we are working very closely with our colleagues in the export promotion agencies like the Commerce Department to make sure that is done. We're also trying to make sure that obstacles that SMEs have had in trading are addressed, like transparency. One of the biggest complaints we hear from SMEs is that they have problem navigating the regulatory structures of different countries, and that's just a disincentive for them to want to export to that market. That's another thing that we're trying to do concretely in the TPP is to minimize the lack of transparency burden and to ensure that SMEs have access to not just the information that they need, but also are able to understand the regulatory procedures in different countries to enable them to better trade there. In terms of the trilateral that Japan, Korea, and China are working to negotiate, I mean, again, it's up to the various economies in the region to determine, what's the best pathway forward for them. We have been working on the TPP as a pathway for achieving the vision of a free trade agreement in the Asia Pacific. There are other things that are happening in Asia, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, where all countries in the region are trying to achieve the vision of more liberalized trade in the Asia Pacific, and there are a variety of ways to do so. We have gone down the pathway of TPP with 10 other partners right now, and again, our goal is to incorporate as many Asia Pacific members into this that are willing to meet the high standards of the agreement. So with that, I think I need to skedaddle, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.